Yoruba manufactured cloth, ironware, and pottery, which were exchanged for salt, leather, and, most importantly, horses from the Sudan to maintain the cavalry. Oyo remained strong for 200 years. It became a protectorate of Great Britain in 1888, before further fragmenting into warring factions. The Oyo state ceased to exist as any sort of power in 18th Benin. The Benin Empire was ruled by the Kwa-speaking Edo people, and by the mid-15th century it was engaged in political expansion and consolidation in the region. Under Oba-Ombosha King Eware, Akan 1450 to 1480 CE, the state was organized for conquest. He solidified central authority and initiated 30 years of war with his neighbors. At the time of his death, the Benin Empire extended to Dahomey in the west, to the Niger Delta in the east, along the West African coast, and to the Yoruba towns in the north. The Oba ruled with advice from the Uzama, a council consisting of chiefs of powerful families and town chiefs of different guilds. Later, its authority was diminished by the establishment of administrative dignitaries. In particular, Iwara's grandson Oba Esije, 1504 to 1550, eroded the power of the Uzama and increased contact and trade with Europeans, especially with the Portuguese, who provided a new source of copper for court art. After the 16th century, Benin mainly exported pepper, ivory, gum, and cotton cloth to the Portuguese and Dutch, who resold it to other African societies along the coast. Women wielded political power in the empire. For example, the Queen Mother, who produced a future Oba, wielded immense political influence. Benin was never a significant exporter of slaves. By the early 1700s, the empire was wrecked with dynastic disputes and civil wars. It regained much of its former power in the reigns of Oba Erazoyan and Oba Akingbuda. In 1897, the British sacked Benin City. Sungbo's Eredo and the walls of Benin were built amid 1st millennium CE, prior to 10th century CE. Niger Delta and Igbo. The Niger Delta comprised numerous city-states with numerous forms of government comparable to those of the Swahili people in East Africa. These city-states were protected by the waterways and thick vegetation of the delta. Some, like Boni, Kalabari, and Wari, had kings. Others, like Brass, were republics with small senates, and those at Cross River and Old Calabar were ruled by merchants of the Ekpi society. The Ekpi society regulated trade and made rules for members known as house systems. Some of these houses, like the Pebbles of Boni, were well known in the Americas and Europe. The region was transformed by trade in the 17th century CE. The Igbo primarily lived east of the delta, with the exception of the Anioma on the west side of the delta. The Igbo kingdom of Nri rose in the 10th century CE, with Eze Nri denoting its leader. It was a political entity composed of villages, where each village was autonomous, independent with its own territory and name, and recognized by its neighbors. Villages were democratic, with all males and sometimes females a part of the decision-making process. Graves at Igbo Ukwu, 800 CE, contained brass artifacts of local manufacture and glass beads from Egypt or India, indicative of extra-regional trade. The Aro Confederacy was a political union orchestrated by the Igbo subgroup, the Aro people, centered in the Aro-Chukwu Kingdom in present-day southeastern Nigeria. It was founded at the end of the 16th century, and by the 18th and 19th centuries, their influence and presence reached across eastern Nigeria into parts of the Niger Delta and southern Igala. Later migrations. Through pathways taken by caravan or via travel amid the Almoravid period, a West African population, Igishtal sub-Saharan West Africans, may have introduced the 29 AYG thalassemia mutation, found in notable amounts among African Americans, into the North African region of Morocco. Painted rock art from Manding peoples are found largely in Mali, where Malinka and Bambara peoples reside. The Manding rock art, developed using black, white, or red paint, is primarily composed of geometric art forms, as well as animal, e.g. saurian, and human art forms. Some of the Manding rock art may relate to circumcision rituals for initiates. During the 15th century CE, migrations from the northern area of Guinea and southern area of Mali may have resulted in the creation of Manding rock art in the northern area of Mali, e.g. Yobri, Nabruk, southeastern area of Burkina Faso, e.g. Takutala, Sourkundingweye, and Dogon country. Slave trade. Following the collapse of the Songhai Empire in the 16th century CE, a number of smaller states arose across West Africa, including the Bambara Empire of Segu, the Lesser Bambara Kingdom of Kaarta, the Fula Malinke Kingdom of Kasso in present-day Mali's Kayes region, and the Kenadougou Empire of Sikasso. European traders first became a force in the region in the 15th century, with the Portimão establishment of a Portuguese trading post at Arguin Island, off the coast of present-day Senegal. By 1475, Portuguese traders had reached as far as the Bight of Benin. The Atlantic slave trade began almost immediately after this, based on the already well-established slave trading capacity of the Islamic world, with the Portuguese taking hundreds of captives back to their country for use as slaves. It began on grand scale after Christopher Columbus' voyages to the Americas and the subsequent demand for cheap colonial labor. In 1510, the Spanish crown initiated Spain's involvement in the Atlantic slave trade, and it was followed over the next centuries by other European states. By 1650, the slave trade was in full force at a number of sites along the coast of West Africa, and over the coming centuries would result in severely reduced growth for the region's population and economy. The expanding slave trade produced significant populations of West Africans living in the New World, recently colonized by Europeans. The oldest known remains of African slaves in the Americas were found in Mexico in early 2006 and are thought to date from the late 16th to mid-17th centuries. As the demand for slaves increased, some African rulers sought to supply the demand by constant war against their neighbors, resulting in fresh captives. States such as Dahomey in modern-day Benin and the Bambara Empire in modern-day Mali based much of their economy on the exchange of slaves for European goods, particularly firearms that they then employed to capture more slaves. During the colonial era, the Dutch colonial authorities in West Africa were active in recruiting African slaves into the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, known as Belanda Hittim, as it was believed that black Africans were more immune than Europeans to the tropical diseases present in the Dutch East Indies. Recruitment changed format after the Atlantic slave trade was abolished by European and American governments in the 19th century. For instance, Herjuwan was the first year when only volunteers were accepted for the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. Slavery in the Americas persisted in some capacity after the end of the Atlantic slave trade, until Brazil abolished it in 1888. Today, descendants of West Africans make up large and important segments of the population in Brazil, the Caribbean, the United States, and throughout the New World. A modern genetic research study of African Americans in several major U.S. cities concluded that their common ancestry originated most prominently in Western Africa, consistent with prior genetic studies and the history of the slave trade. Colonial period. Colonization of Africa. In 1725, the cattle-herding Fulanis of Fouta Djallon launched the first major reformist jihad of the region, overthrowing the local animist, Mande-speaking elites and attempting to somewhat democratize their society. A similar movement occurred on a much broader scale in the Hausa city-states of Nigeria. Under Uthman Dan Fodio, an imam influenced by the teachings of Sidi Ahmed al-Tijani, Uthman preached against the elitist Islam of the then-dominant Qadariyya Brotherhood, winning a broad base of support amongst the common people. Uthman's Fulani Empire was soon one of the region's largest states and inspired the later jihads of Masina Empire founder Sekou Ahmadu in present-day Mali and the cross-Sudan Tukulur conqueror El Hajj Umar Tall. At the same time, the Europeans started to travel into the interior of Africa to trade and explore. Scottish explorer Mungo Park, 1771 to 1806, made the first serious expedition into the region's interior, tracing the Niger River as far as Timbuktu. French armies followed, not long after. In 1774, it was noted that the extensive coastline and deep rivers of Africa had not been utilized for correspondence or commerce, even though maps in the same volume clearly show the Gum Coast, Grain Coast, Ivory Coast, and Gold Coast, Malachy. Postlethwaite writes in this book, "It is melancholy to observe that a country which has near 10,000 miles seacoast, and noble, large, deep rivers should yet have no navigation, streams penetrating into the very center of the country, but of no benefit to it, innumerable people without knowledge of each other, correspondence, or commerce." Scramble for Africa. The scramble for Africa was the invasion, conquest, and colonization of most of Africa by 7 Western European powers driven by the Second Industrial Revolution during the late 19th century and early 20th century in the era of new imperialism. Belgium, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. In 1870, 10% of the continent was formally under European control. By 1914, this figure had risen to almost 90%. The only states retaining sovereignty were Liberia, Ethiopia, Egba, Hausa, Senussia, Mbunda, the Dervish state, and the Ovambo kingdoms, most of which were later conquered. The 1884 Berlin Conference regulated European colonization and trade in Africa and is seen as emblematic of the scramble. In the last quarter of the 19th century, there were considerable political rivalries between the European empires, which provided the impetus for the colonization. The later years of the 19th century saw a transition from informal imperialism, military influence, and economic dominance to direct rule. With the decline of the European colonial empires in the wake of the 2 world wars, most African colonies gained independence during the Cold War and decided to keep their colonial borders in the Organization of African Unity Conference of 1964 due to fears of civil wars and regional instability, placing emphasis on Pan-Africanism. In the scramble for Africa in the 1880s, Europeans started to colonize the inland of West Africa, as they had previously mostly controlled trading ports along the coasts and rivers. Samori Touré's newly founded Wassulo Empire was the last to fall. And with his capture in 1898, military resistance to French colonial rule effectively ended. France dominated West Africa, followed by Britain. Small colonial operations were held by Germany until 1914, and also by Spain and Portugal. Only Liberia was independent before 1958. After the slave trade died out, Denmark and the Netherlands sold off their small holdings. Britain operated from 4 small colonies on the West African coast, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, Lagos, and the Niger. British trade in tropical products reached £4 million per year and was entirely handled by a small number of resident merchants. There were no permanent British settlers or military bases. The posts were held entirely for trade purposes, and also as calling stations. London had no long-term plans to join them together or go inland. British diplomats negotiated military agreements with local tribes who needed British protection from the expansionist Ashanti tribes. Britain fought repeated Anglo-Ashanti wars in the Gold Coast in 1823. 1824 to 1831, 1864, 1894, 1895, and 1900. Only the last two were clear British victories. French pretensions in West Africa were much more ambitious and involved not just trade, but rebuilding the French Empire and bringing new populations into the umbrella of French civilization and Catholicism. There were dreams of consolidating a vast African empire by expanding south from the Mediterranean into the Sahara Desert, moving east toward the Nile River, and moving south toward King Leopold's Congo. Post-colonial period. Following World War II, campaigns for independence sprang up across West Africa, most notably in Ghana, under the Pan-Africanist Kwame Nkrumah, 1909 to 1972. Ghana became the first country of sub-Saharan Africa to achieve independence in 1957, followed by Guinea under the guidance of Sékou Touré the next year. After a decade of protests, riots, and clashes, French West Africa voted for autonomy in a 1958 referendum, dividing it into the states of today. Most of the British colonies gained autonomy the following decade. Out of the 17 nations that achieved their independence in 1960, the Year of Africa, 9 were West African countries. Many founding fathers of West African nations like Nkrumah, Touré, Leopold Sédar Senghor, Modibo Keïta, Sylvanus Olympio, Felix Houphouët-Boigny, Siaka Stevens, and Abubakar Tafawa Balewa consolidated their power during the post-independence 1960s by gradually eroding democratic institutions and civil society. In 1973, Guinea-Bissau proclaimed its independence from Portugal and was internationally recognized following the 1974 Carnation Revolution in Portugal. West African political history since independence has been characterized by African socialism. Senghor, Nkrumah, and Touré all embraced the idea of African socialism, whereas Houphouët-Boigny and Liberia's William Tubman remained suspicious of it. 1983 saw the rise of socialist Thomas Sankara era, often titled the Che Guevara of Africa, to power in Burkina Faso. Since independence, West Africa has suffered from the same problems as much of the African continent, particularly dictatorships, political corruption, and military coups. At the time of his death in 2005, for example, Togo's Etienne Ayadema was among the world's longest-ruling dictators. International conflicts have been few, with Mali and Burkina Faso's nearly bloodless Agadir Strip War a rare exception. Civil wars. The region of West Africa has seen a number of civil wars in its recent past, including the Nigerian Civil War, 1967 to 1970, 2 civil wars in Liberia, 1989 to 1997 and 99 to 2003, a decade of fighting in Sierra Leone, 1991 to 2002, the Guinea-Bissau Civil War, 1998 to 1999, and 2 recent conflicts in Côte d'Ivoire, 2002 to 2007 and 2010 to 2011. Nigerian Civil War, 1960 to 1970. The Nigerian Civil War, 6 July to 15 January 1970, also known as the Biafran War, was fought between Nigeria and the Republic of Biafra, a secessionist state which had declared its independence from Nigeria in 1967. Nigeria was led by General Yakubu Gowon, and Biafra by Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Emeka Odumegwu Ojukwu. The conflict resulted from political, ethnic, cultural, and religious tensions which preceded the United Kingdom's formal decolonization of Nigeria from 1960 to 1963. Immediate causes of the war in 1966 included a military coup, a counter-coup, and anti-Igbo pogroms in the northern region. The pogroms and the exodus of surviving Igbos from the northern region to the Igbo homelands in the eastern region led the leadership of the eastern region, whose population was 2/3 Igbo, to conclude that the Nigerian federal government would not protect them and that they must protect themselves in an independent Biafra. After gaining full independence from the British Empire in 1963, Nigeria established the First Republic, which was heavily influenced by British democracy and relied on majority rule. In less than 3 years, though the Republic fell after a successful coup d'etat led by southern Nigerian rebels on 15th of January 1966. The fall of the First Republic increased political, economic, ethnic, cultural, and religious tensions between North and South Nigeria, which had been present since colonial times. This led to the military governor of southeastern Nigeria, Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, seceding southeastern Nigeria, citing northern massacres and electoral fraud. The independent state became known as the Republic of Biafra. Northern Nigeria opposed the claim of southern secession, and the Nigerian government called for police action in the area. The armed forces of Nigeria were sent in to occupy and take back the Republic of Biafra. Nigerian forces successfully seized Biafra through the capture of Nsukka, the capture of Ogoja, capture of Abakaliki, and the capture of Enugu. Their military successes were largely due to the advantaged army of Nigeria. By 970, Biafran General Chukwuemeka Odumegwu fled to the neighboring nation of Côte d'Ivoire, and Biafra surrendered due to lack of resources and leadership. The secessionist state officially reunited with northern Nigeria on 15 January 1970. The conflict is estimated to have killed roughly 1 million people. First Liberian Civil War, 1989-97. The First Liberian Civil War was an internal conflict in Liberia from 1989 until 1997. The conflict killed about 250,000 people, and eventually led to the involvement of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the United Nations. The peace did not last long, and in 1999, the Second Liberian Civil War broke out. In 1980, Samuel Doe led a coup that overthrew the elected government. In 1985, he held elections that were widely considered fraudulent, leading to an unsuccessful coup attempt by General Thomas Kwiwankpa. In December 1989, former government minister Charles Taylor moved into the country from the neighboring Ivory Coast to start an uprising meant to topple the Doe government. The National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPIL, led by Taylor, soon splintered and devolved into battle with Prince Johnson's rebel group, the Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, INPFL, for control in the capital, Monrovia. In 1990, Johnson seized control of the capital and executed Doe brutally. Second Liberian Civil War, 1999 to 2003. The Second Liberian Civil War began in 1999 when a rebel group backed by the government of neighboring Guinea, the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, LOURD, emerged in northern Liberia. In early 2003, a second rebel group, the Movement for Democracy in Liberia, MODEL, emerged in the south, and by June-July 2003, Charles Taylor's government controlled only a third of the country. The capital, Monrovia, was besieged by LOURD, and the group's shelling of the city resulted in the deaths of many civilians. Thousands of people were displaced from their homes as a result of the conflict. The Accra Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed by the warring parties on August 18, 2000, marking the political end of the conflict and the beginning of the country's transition to democracy under the National Transitional Government of Liberia, led by interim President Jude Bryant until the Liberian general election of 2005. Sierra Leone Civil War, 1991 to 2002. The Civil War in Sierra Leone began on 23rd of March 1991 as a result of an attempted overthrow against the administration of President Joseph Saidu Momoh. The rebels went under the guise of the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, led by Fode Sanko, a previous army corporal. The Sierra Leonean government called for action, and soon the Sierra Leone Army, SLA, was sent in to control the situation and take back RUF-occupied territory. By 1992, President Joseph Momo was ousted by a successful military coup led by Captain Valentine Strasser. Captain Strasser soon established multi-party democratic elections in the region. On 18th of January 2002, the civil war was officially ended by former President Kabah. During the 11-year conflict, roughly 50,000 Sierra Leoneans were killed, with 2,000 displaced. Guinea-Bissau's Civil War, 1998 to 1999. Before the Civil War began, an attempted coup d'etat took place led by military Brigadier General Ansoumana Mané. Mané, leading the coup, blamed the presidency of João Bernardo Vieira for the poverty and corruption of Guinea-Bissau. President Vieira, controlling the armed forces, soon fired Mané from his position of Brigadier General. He was fired on charges of supplying Senegal rebels. On the 7th of June 1998, a second coup d'etat began. The coup once again failed. Soon after, rebels received aid from the neighboring nations of Senegal and Guinea-Conakry. The conflict sparked a civil war. Many soldiers in the armed forces of Guinea-Bissau joined the side of the rebels. This was in part due to the government not paying its soldiers. The rebels continued to fight from 1998 to 1999. President Vieira was ousted on 7 May 1999. By 10 May 1999, the war ended when President Vieira signed an unconditional surrender in a Portuguese embassy. Approximately 655 were killed as a result of the conflict. First Ivorian Civil War, 2002-2000. In the early 2000s, the Ivory Coast, also known as Côte d'Ivoire, experienced an economic recession. The recession began as a result of the previous economic boom crashing the economy as a whole. This led to the predominantly Muslim north and predominantly Christian south of the Ivory Coast becoming politically divided. The southern Ivory Coast was in control of the Ivorian government. The north was under the control of the rebel movement. The civil war between the two began officially on the 19th September 2000, when rebels launched a series of attacks on the south. The city of Abidjan was primarily targeted. Northern rebels were successful in the attacks. As a result of the chaos, President Robert Guei was killed in the rebellions. The south retailed with military action. France supported the south and sent 100 soldiers to the region and called for United Nations action. French action in the area went under the guise and codename of Opération Licorne. By 2004, most fighting in the region ceased. On the 4th March 2007, the civil war officially ended with the signing of a peace treaty. Second Ivorian Civil War, 2010-2011. Historiographic and conceptual problems. The current major problem in African studies that Mohammed, 2010-2012, identified is the inherited religious, orientalist, colonial paradigm that European Africanists have preserved in present-day secularist, post-colonial, Anglophone African historiography. African and African-American scholars also bear some responsibility in perpetuating this European Africanist preserved paradigm. Following conceptualizations of Africa developed by Leo Africanus and Hegel, European Africanists conceptually separated continental Africa into two racialized regions, Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, as a racist geographic construction, serves as an objectified, compartmentalized region of Africa proper, Africa Noir or Black Africa. The African diaspora is also considered to be a part of the same racialized construction as Sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa serves as a racialized region of European Africa, which is conceptually disconnected from Sub-Saharan Africa and conceptually connected to the Middle East, Asia, and the Islamic world. As a result of these racialized constructions and the conceptual separation of Africa, darker-skinned North Africans, such as the so-called Haratan, who have long resided in the Maghreb and do not reside south of Saharan Africa, have become analogically alienated from their indigeneity and historic reality in North Africa. While the origin of the term Haratin remains speculative, the term may not date much earlier than the 18th century CE and has been involuntarily assigned to darker-skinned Maghrebian. Prior to the modern use of the term Haratin as an identifier and utilized in contrast to Biden or Heidi white, Summer Asmar, Sud Aswad, or Sudan Sudani, black-brown, were Arabic terms utilized as identifiers for darker-skinned Maghrebians before the modern period. Haratin is considered to be an offensive term by the darker-skinned Maghrebians it is intended to identify. For example, people in the southern region, Jijidai, Wadnoun, Dar of Morocco consider it to be an offensive term. Despite its questionable historicity and etymology, European colonialists and European Africanists have used the term Haratin as identifiers for groups of black and apparently mixed people found in Algeria, Mauritania, and Morocco. The Sadian invasion of the Songhai Empire serves as the precursor to later narratives that grouped darker-skinned Maghrebians together and identified their origins as sub-Saharan West Africa, with gold serving as a motivation behind the Sadian invasion of the Songhai Empire. This made way for changes in latter behaviors toward dark-skinned Africans. As a result of changing behaviors toward dark-skinned Africans, darker-skinned Maghrebians were forcibly recruited into the army of Ismail ibn Sharif as the Black Guard, based on the claim of them having descended from enslaved peoples from the times of the Sadian invasion. Sharafa historians of the modern period would later utilize these events in narratives about the manumission of enslaved Hartani, a vague term which, by merit of it needing further definition, is implicit evidence for its questionable historicity. The narratives derived from Sharafa historians would later become analogically incorporated into the Americanized narratives, the trans-Saharan slave trade, imported enslaved sub-Saharan West Africans, darker-skinned Maghrebian freedmen of the present-day European Africanist paradigm. As opposed to having been developed through field research, the analogy in the present-day European Africanist paradigm, which conceptually alienates, dehistoricized, and denaturalized darker-skinned North Africans in North Africa and darker-skinned Africans throughout the Islamic world at large, is primarily rooted in an Americanized textual tradition inherited from 19th century European Christian abolitionists. Consequently, reliable history, as opposed to an antiquated analogy-based history for darker-skinned North Africans and darker-skinned Africans in the Islamic world, are limited. Part of the textual tradition generally associates an inherited status of servant with dark skin, e.g., Negro labor, Negro cultivators, Negroid slaves, freedman. The European Africanist paradigm uses this as the primary reference point for its construction of origins, narratives for darker-skinned North Africans, e.g., imported slaves from sub-Saharan West Africa. With darker-skinned North Africans or darker-skinned Africans in the Islamic world treated as an allegory of alterity. Another part of the textual tradition is the trans-Saharan slave trade, and their presence in these regions are treated as that of an African diaspora in North Africa and the Islamic world. Altogether, darker-skinned North Africans, e.g., black and apparently mixed Maghrebians, darker-skinned Africans in the Islamic world, the inherited status of servant associated with dark skin, and the trans-Saharan slave trade are conflated and modeled in analogy with African Americans and the transatlantic slave trade. The trans-Saharan slave trade has been used as a literary device in narratives that analogically explain the origins of darker-skinned North Africans in North Africa and the Islamic world. Camel trains have been equated with slave ships, and the amount of forcibly enslaved Africans transported across the Sahara are alleged to be numerically comparable to the considerably large amount of forcibly enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic Ocean. The simulated narrative of Comparable numbers is contradicted by the limited presence of darker-skinned North Africans in the present-day Maghreb. As part of this simulated narrative, post-classical Egypt has also been characterized as having plantations. Another part of this simulated narrative is an Orientalist construction of hypersexualized Moors, concubines, and eunuchs. Concubines and harems have been used as an explanatory bridge between the allegation of comparable numbers of forcibly enslaved Africans and the limited number of present-day darker-skinned Maghrebians who have been characterized as their diasporic descendants. Eunuchs were characterized as sentinels who guarded these harems. The simulated narrative is also based on the major assumption that the indigenous peoples of the Maghreb were once purely white Berbers, who then became biracialized through miscegenation with black concubines, existing within a geographic racial binary of pale-skinned Moors residing further north, closer to the Mediterranean region, and dark-skinned Moors residing further south, closer to the Sahara. The religious polemical narrative involving the suffering of enslaved European Christians of the Barbary slave trade has also been adapted to fit the idea of a comparable number of enslaved Africans transported by Muslim slaver caravans from the south of Saharan Africa into North Africa and the Islamic world. Despite inheriting 19th-century religious polemical narratives, the use of race in the secularism of present-day European Africanist paradigm has given the paradigm an appearance of possessing scientific quality. The religious polemical narrative, Mjiji, holy cause, hostile neologisms of 19th-century European abolitionists about Africa and Africans are silenced, but still preserved, in the secularist narratives of the present-day European Africanist paradigm. The Orientalist stereotype of hypersexuality of the Moors was viewed by 19th-century European abolitionists as deriving from the Quran, the reference to times prior, often used in concert with biblical references by 19th-century European abolitionists, may indicate that realities described of Moors may have been literary fabrications. The purpose of these apparent literary fabrications may have been to affirm their view of the Bible as greater than the Quran, and to affirm the viewpoints held by the readers of their composed works. The adoption of 19th-century European abolitionists' religious polemical narrative into the present-day European Africanist paradigm may have been due to its correspondence with the established textual tradition. The use of stereotyped hypersexuality for Moors are what 19th-century European abolitionists and the present-day European Africanist paradigm have in common. Due to a lack of considerable development in field research regarding enslavement in Islamic societies, this has resulted in the present-day European Africanist paradigm relying on unreliable estimates for the trans-Saharan slave trade. Insufficient data has also been used as a justification for continued use of the faulty present-day European Africanist paradigm. Darker-skinned Maghrebians, particularly in Morocco, have grown weary of the lack of discretion foreign academics have shown toward them, bear resentment toward the way they have been depicted by foreign academics, and consequently find the intended activities of foreign academics to be predictable. Rather than continuing to rely on the faulty present-day European Africanist paradigm, Mohammed, 2012, recommends revising and improving the current Africanist paradigm, e.g., critical inspection of the origins and introduction of the present characterization of the Saharan caravan, reconsideration of what makes the trans-Saharan slave trade within its own context in Africa distinct from the transatlantic slave trade, realistic consideration of the experiences of darker-skinned Maghrebians within their own regional context. Marola, 2017, had indicated that the academic study of sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa by Europeans developed with North Africa was conceptually subsumed within the Middle East and Arab world, whereas the study of sub-Saharan Africa was viewed as conceptually distinct from North Africa and as its own region, viewed as inherently the same. The common pattern of conceptual separation of continental Africa into two regions and the view of conceptual sameness within the region of sub-Saharan Africa has continued until present day. Yet, with increasing exposure of this problem, discussion about the conceptual separation of Africa has begun to develop. The Sahara had served as a trans-regional zone for peoples in Africa. Authors from various countries, e.g., Algeria, Cameroon, Sudan, in Africa have critiqued the conceptualization of the Sahara as a regional barrier and provided counter-arguments supporting the interconnectedness of continental Africa. There are historic and cultural connections as well as trade between West Africa, North Africa, and East Africa. North Africa with Niger and Mali, North Africa with Tanzania and Sudan. Major hubs of Islamic learning in Niger and Mali. Africa has been conceptually compartmentalized into meaning Black Africa, Africa south of the Sahara, and Sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa has been conceptually orientalized and separated from Sub-Saharan Africa. While its historic development has occurred within a longer time frame, the epistemic development, e.g., form, content, of the present-day racialized conceptual separation of Africa came as a result of the Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa. In African and Berber literary studies, scholarship has remained largely separate from one another. The conceptual separation of Africa in these studies may be due to how editing policies of studies in the Anglophone and Francophone world are affected by the international politics of the Anglophone and Francophone. While studies in the Anglophone world have more clearly followed the trend of the conceptual separation of Africa, the Francophone world has been more nuanced, which may stem from imperial policies relating to French colonialism in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. As the study of North Africa has largely been initiated by the Arabophone and Francophone world, denial of the Arabic language having become Africanized throughout the centuries, it has been present in Africa has shown that the conceptual separation of Africa remains pervasive in the Francophone world. This denial may stem from historic development of the characterization of an Islamic Arabia existing as a diametric binary to Europe. Among studies in the Francophone world, ties between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa have been denied or downplayed, while the ties religious, cultural, between the regions and peoples, Arab language and literature with Berber language and literature of the Middle East and North Africa have been established by diminishing the differences between the two and selectively focusing on the similarities between the two. In the Francophone world, construction of racialized regions such as Black Africa, Sub-Saharan Africans, and White Africa, North Africans, e.g., Berbers and Arabs, has also developed. Despite having invoked and utilized identities in reference to the racialized conceptualizations of Africa, e.g., North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, to oppose imposed identities, Berbers have invoked North African identity to oppose Arabized and Islamicized identities. And Sub-Saharan Africans, negritude, Black consciousness, and the African diaspora, Black is beautiful, have invoked and utilized Black identity to oppose colonialism and racism. While Berber studies has largely sought to establish ties between Berbers and North Africa with Arabs and the Middle East, Merola, 2017, indicated that efforts to establish ties between Berbers and North Africa with Sub-Saharan Africans and Sub-Saharan Africa have recently started. Health. Traditional African medicine. Traditional African medicine is a holistic discipline involving indigenous herbalism and African spirituality. Practitioners claim to be able to cure various and diverse conditions. Modern science has, in the past, considered methods of traditional knowledge as primitive and backward. Under colonial rule, traditional diviner healers were outlawed because they were considered by many nations to be practitioners of witchcraft and declared illegal by the colonial authorities, creating a war against witchcraft and magic. During this time, attempts were also made to control the sale of herbal medicines. As colonialism and Christianity spread through Africa, colonialists built general hospitals and Christian missionaries built private ones with the hopes of making headway against widespread diseases. Little was done to investigate the legitimacy of these practices, as many foreigners believed that the native medical practices were pagan and superstitious and could only be suitably fixed by inheriting Western methods. During times of conflict, opposition has been particularly vehement, as people are more likely to call on the supernatural realm. Consequently, doctors and health practitioners have, in most cases, continued to shun traditional practitioners despite their contribution to meeting the basic health needs of the population. In recent years, the treatments and remedies used in traditional African medicine have gained more appreciation from researchers in Western science. Developing countries have begun to realize the high costs of modern healthcare systems and the technologies that are required, thus proving Africa's dependence on it. Due to this, interest has recently been expressed in integrating traditional African medicine into the continent's national healthcare systems. Disease. Disease has been a hindrance to human development in West Africa throughout history. The environment, especially the tropical rainforests, allow many single-cell organisms, parasites, and bacteria to thrive and prosper. Prior to the slave trade, West Africans strived to maintain ecological balance, controlling vegetation and game, and thereby minimizing the prevalence of local diseases. The increased amount and intensity of warfare due to the slave trade meant that the ecological balance could not be sustained. Endemic diseases became epidemic in scale. Genetic mutations developed that provided increased resistance to disease, such as sickle cell, evident in the Kwa forest agriculturalists from c. 700 CE, providing some protection from malaria. HIV/AIDS. AIDS in Africa and Western Africa. In the 1990s, AIDS became a significant problem for the region, particularly in Côte d'Ivoire, Liberia, and Nigeria. The onset of the HIV epidemic in the region began in 1985 with reported cases in Benin and Nigeria, and in nearby countries such as Côte d'Ivoire in subsequent years. AIDS was at first considered a disease of gay men and drug addicts, but in Africa it took off among the general population. As a result, those involved in the fight against HIV began to emphasize aspects such as preventing transmission from mother to child, or the relationship between HIV and poverty, inequality of the sexes, and so on, rather than emphasizing the need to prevent transmission by unsafe sexual practices or drug injection. This change in emphasis resulted in more funding, but was not effective in preventing a drastic rise in HIV prevalence. The global response to HIV and AIDS has improved considerably in recent years. Funding comes from many sources, the largest of which are the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, and the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. As of 2011, HIV prevalence in Western Africa is lowest in Senegal and highest in Nigeria, which has the second largest number of people living with HIV in Africa after South Africa. Nigeria's infection rate relative to the entire population is much lower, 3.7%, compared to South Africa's 17.3%. Ebola virus disease. Ebola virus disease, first identified in 1976, typically occurs in outbreaks in tropical regions of sub-Saharan Africa, including West Africa. From 1976 through 2013, the World Health Organization reported 1,716 confirmed cases. The largest outbreak to date is the ongoing 2014 West Africa Ebola virus outbreak, which is affecting Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Nigeria. The outbreak began in Guinea in December 2013, but was not detected until March 24th, after which it spread to Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria. The outbreak is caused by the Zaire Ebola virus, known simply as the Ebola virus, EBOV. It is the most severe outbreak of Ebola in terms of the number of human cases and fatalities since the discovery of the virus in 1976. As of 16 August 2014, the World Health Organization, WHO, reported 230 suspected cases and 129 deaths, 133 confirmed cases and 760 deaths, and 2. On 8 August, it formally designated the outbreak as a public health emergency of international concern. This is a legal designation used only twice before, for the 2009 H1N1 swine flu pandemic and the 2010 resurgence of polio, and invokes legal measures on disease prevention, surveillance, control, and response by 194 signatory countries. Various aid organizations and international bodies, including the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and the European Commission, have donated funds and mobilized personnel to help counter the outbreak. Charities including Médecins Sans Frontières, the Red Cross, and Samaritan's Purse are also working in the area. Famine and Africa. Famine has been an occasional but serious problem in West Africa. In the 1680s, famine extended across the entire Sahel, and in 1738, half the population of Timbuktu died of famine. Some colonial pacification efforts often caused severe famine. The introduction of cash crops such as cotton and forcible measures to impel farmers to grow these crops sometimes impoverished the peasantry in many areas, such as northern Nigeria, contributing to greater vulnerability to famine when severe drought struck in 1913. For the middle part of the 20th century, agriculturalists, economists, and geographers did not consider Africa to be famine-prone. Most famines were localized and brief food shortages. From 1967 to 1969, large-scale famine occurred in Biafra and Nigeria due to a government blockade of the breakaway territory. It is estimated that 1.5 million people died of starvation due to this famine. Additionally, drought and other government interference with the food supply caused 500,000 Africans to perish in Central and West Africa. Famine recurred in the 1970s and 1980s, when the West African Sahel suffered drought and famine. The Sahelian famine was associated with the slowly growing crisis of pastoralism in Africa, which has seen livestock herding decline as a viable way of life over the last 2 generations. Since the start of the 21st century, more effective early warning and humanitarian response actions have reduced the number of deaths by famine markedly. That said, many African countries are not self-sufficient in food production, relying on income from cash crops to import food. Agriculture in Africa is susceptible to climatic fluctuations, especially droughts which can reduce the amount of food produced locally. Other agricultural problems include soil infertility, land degradation, and erosion, swarms of desert locusts, which can destroy whole crops, and livestock diseases. The Sahara spreads up to 30 miles per year. The most serious famines have been caused by a combination of drought, misguided economic policies, and conflict. Recent famines in Africa include the 2005-06 Niger food crisis, the 2010 Sahel famine, and in 2012 the Sahel drought put over 10 million people in the Western Sahel at risk of famine, according to the Methodist Relief and Development Fund, due to a month-long heat wave. West African cuisine and history. West African peoples were trading with the Arab world centuries before the influence of Europeans. Spices such as cinnamon were introduced and became part of the local culinary traditions. Centuries later, European explorers and slave traders influenced regional cuisines to a limited extent. European merchant and slave ships brought chili peppers and tomatoes from the New World to West Africa, and both became ubiquitous components of West African cuisines, along with peanuts, maize, cassava, and plantains. In turn, these slave ships carried African ingredients to the New World, including black-eyed peas and okra. Around the time of the colonial period, particularly during the scramble for Africa, the European settlers defined colonial borders without regard to pre-existing borders, territories, or cultural differences. This bisected tribes and created colonies with varying culinary styles. As a result, it is difficult to sharply define, for example, Senegalese cuisine. Although the European colonists brought many new ingredients to the African continent, they had relatively little impact on the way people cook in West Africa. Architecture of Africa. Like other aspects of the culture of Africa, the architecture of Africa is exceptionally diverse. Throughout the history of Africa, Africans have developed their own local architectural traditions. In some cases, broader regional styles can be identified, such as the Sudano-Sahelian architecture of West Africa. A common theme in traditional African architecture is the use of fractal scaling. Small parts of the structure tend to look similar to larger parts, such as a circular village made of circular houses. African architecture in some areas has been influenced by external cultures for centuries. According to available evidence, Western architecture has influenced coastal areas since the late 15th century and is now an important source of inspiration for many larger buildings, particularly in major cities. African architecture uses a wide range of materials, including thatch, stick, wood, mud, mud brick, rammed earth, and stone. These material preferences vary by region. North Africa for stone and rammed earth, the Horn of Africa for stone and mortar, West Africa for mud, adobe, Central Africa for thatch, wood, and more perishable materials, Southeast and Southern Africa for stone and thatch, wood. Author Binyavanga Wainaina argues that people from the West would portray Africa as a decrepit and barren land, and had failed to look at the wonders of the continent. History of science and technology in Africa. Africa has the world's oldest record of human technological achievement. The oldest surviving stone tools in the world have been found in Eastern Africa, and later evidence for tool production by humans' hominin ancestors has been found across West, Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. The history of science and technology in Africa since then has, however, received relatively little attention compared to other regions of the world, despite notable African developments in mathematics, metallurgy, architecture, and other fields. Military history of Africa. Military history is the study of armed conflict in the history of humanity and its impact on the societies, cultures, and economies thereof, as well as the resulting changes to local and international relationships. The military history of Africa is one of the oldest military histories in the world. Africa is a continent of many regions with diverse populations speaking thousands of different languages and practicing an array of cultures and religions. These differences have also been the source of much conflict for millennia. Like the history of Africa, military history on the continent is often divided by region. North Africa was part of the Mediterranean cultures and was integral to the military history of classical antiquity, and East Africa has historically had various states which have often warred with some of the world's most powerful. The military history of modern Africa may be divided into three broad time periods: pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. Genetic history of West Africa. The genetic history of West Africa encompasses the genetic history of the people of West Africa. The Sahara served as a trans-regional passageway and place of dwelling for people in Africa during various humid phases and periods throughout the history of Africa. Archaic human DNA. According to a 2020 study by Durvasula et al., There are indications that 2% to 19, or about 6.6 and 7.8 of the DNA of 4 West African populations may have come from an unknown archaic hominin, which split from the ancestor of humans and Neanderthals between 360 Kaya to 1.02 Manya. It also suggests that at least part of this archaic admixture is also present in Eurasians, non-Africans, and that the admixture event or events range from 0 to 124 BP, which includes the period before the out-of-Africa migration and prior to the African-Eurasian split, thus affecting in part the common ancestors of both Africans and Eurasians, non-Africans. Archaic traits found in human fossils of West Africa, e.g., Iho-Elaru fossils, which dates to 13,000 BP, and Central Africa, e.g., Ishango fossils, which dates between 25,000 BP and 20,000 BP, may have developed as a result of admixture between archaic humans and modern humans, or may be evidence of late persisting early modern humans. While Denisovan and Neanderthal ancestry in non-Africans outside of Africa are more certain, archaic human ancestry in Africans is less certain and is too early to be established with certainty. Ancient DNA. As of 2017, human ancient DNA has not been forthcoming in the region of West Africa. The Tafaralts of Morocco, who have been radiocarbon dated between 15,100 cal BP and 13,100 cal BP, and were found to be 63.8 Natufian, were also found to be 36 for sub-Saharan African, Itaji Hadza, which is drawn out most of all by West Africans, Watigo Yoruba Mende. In addition to having similarity with the remnant of a more basal sub-Saharan African lineage, Hega, a basal West African lineage shared between Yoruba and Mende peoples. The sub-Saharan African DNA in the Tafaralt people of the Ibero-Mauritian culture may be best represented by modern West Africans, Yoshigas Yoruba. West African hunter-gatherers in the region of Western Central Africa, Ajay, Shumlaka, Cameroon, particularly between 8,000 BP and 3,000 BP, were found to be related to modern Central African hunter-gatherers, e.g. Baka, Bekola, Biaka, Bedzan. In 4,000 BP, or even earlier during the Mesolithic, there may have been a population that traversed from Africa, e.g. to West Africa or West Central Africa, through the Strait of Gibraltar, into the Iberian Peninsula, where admixing between Africans and Iberians, Iodoi, of northern Portugal, of southern Spain occurred. Based on a small trace presence of sub-Saharan African components in select samples from Iberia and the discovery of a mitogenome L2A1 found in one individual, while all others belong to European mitochondrial haplogroups. In Granada, a Muslim, Mu'ur, of the Cordoba Caliphate, who was of haplogroups E1b1A1 and H1Pl6189, as well as estimated to date between 900 CE and 1000 CE, and a Morisco, who was of haplogroup L2E1, as well as estimated to date between 1500 CE and 1600 CE, were both found to be of sub-Saharan West African, i.e. Gambian, and Liberian descent. Y chromosomal DNA. DNA haplogroups in populations of sub-Saharan Africa. 8 males from Guinea-Bissau, 2 from Niger, 1 from Mali, and 1 from Cabo Verde carried haplogroup A1A. As haplogroup D0, a basal branch of haplogroup DE was found in 3 Nigerian men. Haplogroup DE may have originated in Africa. As of 19,000 years ago, Africans bearing haplogroup E1b likely traversed across the Sahara, from east to west. E1b-M2 likely originated in West Africa or Central Africa. Due to the large numbers of West Africans enslaved in the Atlantic slave trade, most African Americans, Afro-Latin Americans and Afro-Caribbean people are likely to have mixed ancestry from different regions of Western Africa. 60% of African Americans in the study were of the E1b1a haplogroup, within which 22.9% were particularly of the EM2 haplogroup. They also possessed numerous SNPs, e.g. U175, U209, U1E1, U290, U14, U1Y6, and U2. Mitochondrial DNA, haplogroup L2 mtDNA, map of early diversification of modern humans, with haplogroup L2 entering West Africa. Studies of human mitochondrial DNA suggest that all humans share common ancestors from Africa, originated in the southwestern regions near the coastal border of Namibia and Angola at the approximate coordinates 12.5 E, 17.5 with a divergence in the migration path around 37 E, 20.5 near the Red Sea. A particular haplogroup of DNA, L2, evolved between 87,000 and 107,000 years ago, or approx. 90,000 YBP. Its age and widespread distribution and diversity across the continent makes its exact origin point within Africa difficult to trace with any confidence. An origin for several L2 groups in West or Central Africa seems likely, with the highest diversity in West Africa. Most of its subclades are largely confined to West and Western Central Africa. Between 75,000 BP and 60,000 BP, Africans bearing haplogroup L3 emerged in East Africa and eventually migrated into and became present in modern West Africans, Central Africans, and non-Africans. During the early period of the Holocene, 50% of sub-Saharan African mitochondrial DNA was introduced into North Africa by West Africans, and the other 50% was introduced by East Africans. During the modern period, a greater number of West Africans introduced sub-Saharan African mitochondrial DNA into North Africa than East Africans. During the early period of the Holocene, sub-Saharan African mitochondrial DNA was introduced into Europe, mostly in Iberia. West Africans probably migrated across Sahelian Africa, North Africa, and the Strait of Gibraltar into Europe and introduced 60 of sub-Saharan African mitochondrial DNA. During the modern period, West Africans introduced 7% of sub-Saharan African mitochondrial DNA into Liberia and other parts of Europe, possibly by sea voyage. Around 18,000 BP, Mende people, along with Gambian peoples, grew in population size. In 15,000 BP, Niger-Congo speakers may have migrated from the Sahelian region of West Africa along the Senegal River and introduced haplogroup L2A1 into North Africa, resulting in modern Mauritanian peoples and Berbers of Tunisia inheriting it. Between 15,000 and 7,000 of sub-Saharan African mitochondrial DNA was introduced into Southwest Asia by East Africans, largely in the region of Arabia, which constitute 50% of sub-Saharan African mitochondrial DNA in modern Southwest Asia. In the modern period, 68% of sub-Saharan African mitochondrial DNA was introduced by East Africans, and 22% was introduced by West Africans, which constitutes 50% of sub-Saharan African mitochondrial DNA in modern Southwest Asia. Between 11,000 BP and 10,000 BP, Yoruba people and Asan people grew in population size. As early as 11,000 years ago, sub-Saharan West Africans bearing macro haplogroup L, e.g. L1b1a11, L1b1a6a, L1b1a, L1b1an, L2a1k, L2c, may have migrated through North Africa and into Europe, mostly into southern Europe, e.g. Iberia. Amid the Holocene, including the Holocene climate optimum in 8,000 BP, Africans bearing haplogroup L2 spread within West Africa, and Africans bearing haplogroup L3 spread within East Africa. As the largest migration since the out of Africa, Migration from sub-Saharan Africa toward North Africa occurred, by West Africans, Central Africans, and East Africans, resulting in migrations into Europe and Asia. Consequently, sub-Saharan African mitochondrial DNA was introduced into Europe and Asia. Autosomal DNA. During the early period of the Holocene, in 9000 BP, Khoisan-related peoples mixed with the ancestors of the Igbo people, possibly in the Western Sahara. Between 2000 BP and 1500 BP, Nilo-Saharan speakers may have migrated across the Sahel, from East Africa into West Africa, and mixed with Niger-Congo-speaking Beram people. In 710 CE, West African-related populations, e.g., Niger-Congo-speaking Beram people, Bantu speakers, and East African-related populations, Nilo-Saharan-speaking Ethiopians, Nilo-Saharan-speaking Chadians, admixed with one another in northern Nigeria and northern Cameroon. Medical DNA. The genomes of Africans commonly found to undergo adaptation are regulatory DNA, and many cases of adaptation found among Africans relate to diet, physiology, and evolutionary pressures from pathogens. Throughout sub-Saharan Africa, genetic adaptation, or mutation, Duffy blood group, increased rates of GSPD deficiency, sickle cell disease, to malaria has been found among sub-Saharan Africans, which may have initially developed in 7300 BP. Sub-Saharan Africans have more than 90% of the Duffy null genotype. Pediculus. During the Copper Age and early Islamic era of ancient Israel, West Africans may have migrated into ancient Israel and introduced head louse from West Africa. Sickle cells. Amid the Green Sahara, the mutation for sickle cells originated in the Sahara or in the northwest forest region of western Central Africa, e.g. Cameroon, by at least 700 years ago, though possibly as early as 22,000 years ago. The ancestral sickle cell haplotype to modern haplotypes, e.g. Cameroon, Central African Republic, and Benin Senegal haplotypes, may have first arose in the ancestors of modern West Africans, bearing haplogroups E1b1a1l485 and E1d1a1u115, or their ancestral haplogroup E1b1on4732. West Africans, e.g. Yoruba and Isa of Nigeria, bearing the Benin sickle cell haplotype, may have migrated through the northeastern region of Africa into the western region of Arabia. West Africans, e.g. Mendy of Sierra Leone, bearing the Senegal sickle cell haplotype, may have migrated into Mauritania, 77% modern rate of occurrence, and Senegal, 100. They may also have migrated across the Sahara, into North Africa, and from North Africa, into southern Europe, Turkey, and a region near northern Iraq and southern Turkey. Some may have migrated and introduced the Senegal and Benin sickle cell haplotypes into Basra, Iraq, where both occur equally. West Africans bearing the Benin sickle cell haplotype may have migrated into the northern region of Iraq, 69.5%, Jordan, 80%, Lebanon, 73%, Oman, 52.1%, and Egypt, 80.8%, schistosomes, according to Steverding, 20. While not definite, near the African Great Lakes, schistosomes, Ishtigi S. mansoni S. hematobium, underwent evolution. Subsequently, there was an expansion alongside the Nile River. From Egypt, the presence of schistosomes may have expanded via migratory Yoruba people into Western Africa. Thereafter, schistosomes may have expanded via migratory Bantu peoples into the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, and Jija, Southern Africa, Central Africa. Thalassemia. Through pathways taken by caravan or via travel amid the Almoravid period, a population, sub-Saharan West Africans, may have introduced the 29 ASG Vua thalassemia mutation, found in notable amounts among African Americans, into the North African region of Morocco. Domesticated animal DNA. While the Niger-Congo migration may have been from West Africa into Kordofan, possibly from Kordofan, Sudan, Niger-Congo speakers accompanied by undomesticated helmeted guinea fowls may have traversed into West Africa, domesticated the helmeted
Guinea fowls by 3000 BCE and via the Bantu expansion traversed into other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, e.g. Central Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa. West Africa's story is not just one of ancient empires and forgotten kingdoms. It's a story of resilience, innovation, and legacy that still shapes the world today. From the golden age of Mali and Songhai to the fearless warriors of Dahomey, these histories remind us that Africa has always been a land of greatness. But this is just the beginning. There are still so many hidden stories waiting to be uncovered, tales of courage, betrayal, and legendary leaders who changed the course of history. So what do you think was the most fascinating part of West Africa's history? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because we have even more incredible stories coming your way. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep exploring history. West Africa's rich heritage shapes the modern world in areas like art, music, and literature. Understanding this vibrant past not only deepens our perspective of global history, but also honors the enduring contributions West Africans have made to humanity. Take a deeper dive into the fascinating past of West Africa. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos that blend academic insight with engaging storytelling, because history deserves to inspire us all.